Alrighty guys, and welcome to another video. Today we want to take a look into the S5. I love this camera. I love the image that it gets out of it. I love how good the 1080p looks. I love pretty much everything about it except obviously the autofocus, the dreaded Achilles heel of the Panasonic line of cameras. But in this video, I think that I've kind of done enough research and enough understanding of this camera and how to make it actually usable in some situations. So for example, in this situation right here, you've got a talking head, there's not much movement back and forth. I think you're pretty much able to use this autofocus and to trust it, pretty much every time. I haven't really come across a video yet where I've shot it and there seems to be some really bad example of autofocus. So I want to run you through some of the techniques and ideas that I've found that are going to help you get the best autofocus. So if that's something you're interested in, stick around and let's get into it. The biggest issue with the GH5 and the G9 with the autofocus was the pulsing in the background. You might see that I've got a little iPhone light just going on there to help us monitor whether or not that pulsing is happening. It's the type of thing that you might not notice it, but when you do, you can't look away. It's so annoying, and it was often the reason why many people didn't want to use the autofocus on Lumix cameras. Now, they are suggesting that on the S5 that has been fixed or somewhat, and that's what we want to look into today. So right now, I'm shooting in 1080p at 25 frames a second in a log profile. Now, those three things are really important. You might want to remember them for later because from what I've understood, the best settings that you can get with the autofocus rely on those three different factors. So it relies on your picture profile, on your frame rate, and on your resolution. So to start off, we're going to be comparing the differences in autofocus capabilities between the Vlog format and then the natural or the like 709 picture profiles, because like I said, that is one of the three aspects in which you're going to get good or bad autofocus out of this camera. So right now we're shooting in Vlog at 25 frames a second in 1080p. And what have you guys been thinking this whole time I've been doing this video? Can you see pulsing in the background? Has it been losing my face? I haven't actually been keeping an eye on the screen. I've been trying to look at the camera. So what do you guys think about this? In my experience, 25 frames a second can be a little bit dicey if there's too much movement. So if we come forward, it seems to be tracking okay. If I go back, kind of lost me there a little bit. I am right now using the one spot autofocus with human face detection. And it's generally got the one spot box over my face so that as I come forward, it's still on my face, and as I go backwards, it's still on my face. So when the face detection does lose me, that is still trying to orientate it in the right direction. So that's the first issue we're going to look at, and that is how it compares to Vlog and then a standard picture profile. Alright, so we are in 25 frames a second now in 1080p, seeing what the effect that resolution has on the overall autofocus quality. So you can see the bokeh ball in the background here, looking for pulsing there. How is the autofocus in 1080p? We're going to do compared to 4K soon in a second. Seems to be tracking fairly well. Let's have a look now. Okay, we are in 4K at 25 frames per second, wanting to test and see how the resolution jump between 1080 and 4K changes the autofocus performance. I have heard that it is better in 1080p than it is in 4K. Looks like maybe there was a bit of a slow reaction there, so that could be true. Seems like maybe the 4K is just making the processing just a little bit more difficult. It does seem to get there, but just maybe not as quick. I have the same settings on the autofocus speed and the sensitivity. How's the little bokeh ball here going? Is that pulsing? Is that going in and out? What is that looking like? How has the 4K versus 1080p actually turned out? Yeah, it's definitely a bit slower there. And lastly, we want to test out and look at the difference between 50 frames a second and 25 frames a second. Now, the research online suggests that shooting in 50 frames per second will give you a better autofocus ability, because you're doubling the amount of frames that the camera can kind of use to detect and understand the focus that's needed. So shooting in 50 frames is a really good idea for that. The downside is that sometimes when you put 50 frames into a 25 frames timeline, it obviously cuts a bunch of frames, and if you've got too much movement in your scene, that can be pretty jarring, or it won't look as smooth as shooting in 25 frames a second. So that's what we want to test now. We want to see what is the difference between shooting in 50 and 25, and is there a noticeable difference. So I'm going to play two clips here. One is going to be at 50 and one's going to be at 25, and I want you to see if you can figure out which one is which. So let's talk now about the settings within the S5 for this. And I found that AF speed, that's pretty much up to your liking or up to your desirability. Obviously, the faster it is, I think the more unnatural it looks. You want to try and find that nice middle ground. But what is really key is the sensitivity that you set it to. So I found that having it at least 0 or below, or a negative number with the sensitivity is good, and that minimizes the perceived hunting and pulsing in lights and stuff like that. So I right now am shooting at 0.0. I have been shooting some tests at 0.2, and that seems to be a fairly stable set of settings to use. I think if you go all the way to -3, it kind of just really bogs the camera down, and it's probably not something I would suggest. So somewhere between the -2 to 0 range for the sensitivity is what I reckon is best. And your AF speed from anywhere to maybe 0 to 2 is probably best if you're wanting it to be snappy when it does make a change, but keeping that sensitivity low really allows that pulsing to stop, in my opinion. Alrighty, so I just want to run through a few summary things that I think we've learned from this test. The first one is that your sensitivity needs to be around -2, or a little bit higher. If you want to try and minimize that pulsing in the background. If you see in the corner here, I'm actually got it tried on -3 right now. I know I said earlier in the video that -3 is a bad idea, but I just wanted to finally see what -3 looks like and see if it's any more stable and gets rid of the pulsing a little bit. You would have seen in the video there was a little bit of pulsing in different modes. and it's mainly to do with when there's just micro movements, or pretty much like this move here. Like if I do this, it generated pulses, so it'd be interesting to see how it goes with the -3 sensitivity, but that's the main thing. If you're wanting to minimize pulsing, if you've got lights in the background that are going to bloom with in the bokeh, then try to minimize that sensitivity and minimize the motion in it as much as possible, like this in a talking head. So the second thing I wanted to talk about was that I think it was pretty clear that the 4K footage was a little bit slower in the autofocus. It did get there, but it was just a little bit slower. So I would be curious, I didn't run this test, but I would be curious to see if you bump the speed up in 4K mode, if it would kind of match similar setting, or it would match similarly to the 1080 in a slower AF speed mode. So I might do a test like that a bit later, or maybe you could do a test and let me know. The next thing is that the 25 FPS seem to have less pulsing, which is strange. You would have heard me say in the start of the video that 50 FPS is recommended because you get the most frames for the autofocus to work. But it seemed like the 50 FPS actually had more pulsing, which was interesting. So if you're not going to have a lot of movement in your shot, I reckon your best option is probably to shoot 25 and have your sensitivity set quite low. And that way it will really minimize that pulsing in the background. And I think the last thing in terms of picture profile, we clearly saw that the like 709 picture profile, the autofocus was lightning fast. Now I don't think it actually proved to be any different in terms of pulsing, but it certainly did have a lot quicker and a lot snappier autofocus. So they're your three things that you need to keep in mind when you're shooting autofocus on the S5 or Panasonic cameras. Okay, it's your picture profile, because you need to be shooting something with contrast. So Vlog sometimes doesn't work that well. I feel like most of the times in this video it actually worked quite well, but it is something you need to be aware of if you're not shooting a contrasty scenario like this. Second one is frame rate. If you're wanting something with pinpoint accuracy, then you're going to need to shoot at 50 FPS. But that will, I think, increase the pulsing in the background. So if you've got lights or anything that's blooming with the bokeh in the background, that's going to be noticeable. So depending on what you're needing, if you're needing just a nice static shot like this, I'd suggest maybe shooting 25 frames a second to minimize that pulsing, or 50 if you're needing a lot of kind of quick movements. So the processor is looking at 50 frames opposed to 20 frames a second to get that focus right. And lastly, it is resolution. I think 1080p on this camera looks great, like it did with the GH5, and you actually get the best results in 1080p. So unless you need 4K, I would suggest shooting in 1080p as well. So hopefully this has helped you guys. I'll be keen to know your experience with this camera and how you've gotten the best out of the autofocus. If I've missed anything, let me know in the comments below. But other than that, have a great day, and thanks for tuning in for another episode.